All right, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank you for keeping the memory and the history and the truth of the Holocaust alive. Let's see if I can do this. I always start off with a quote by professor and author and civil rights activist Julius Lester. And my screen is, okay. And the quote is, if you can see it, is, "History is not just facts and events. History is also a pain in the heart. And we repeat history until we are able to make another's pain in the heart our own." My mother's story is my pain in the heart. And it's not easy for me to tell it, but if by telling it and talking about the tragedies of the Holocaust, I can reach just one person and help them to understand that pain and to understand what happens when we respond to hatred and bigotry with fear or indifference, then it's well worth telling the story. 11 million people were murdered by the Nazi regime. Out of that number, 5 million were either political opponents or resistors, Roma, people with mental or physical disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, or homosexuals. The remaining were 6 of the 6 million were Jews. There were no such words as Holocaust or genocide until after World War II. These words came into being because of what the Nazis perpetrated. My mother did not like to talk about her life during the Holocaust. She didn't want to burden anyone or have anyone feel sad. And it was difficult for her to talk about it because it brought back a lot of very painful memories. However, my father, who was fortunate enough to be able to immigrate to America before the war, lost all but a few cousins of the family left in Poland. And he felt it was important for my brothers and me to know what had happened to them and why. So my mother began to write her story. These are some of the pages that she wrote. Unfortunately, she never finished writing them, and they sat in a drawer in my home for many years. And I didn't pay that much attention to them until after her death in 2006. So when I decided to begin telling her story, I had these pages and bits and pieces she had told me through the years, and then an audio recording I made with her over 30 years ago. I took what I had and I began researching her information using the internet to fill in the blanks. My mother's story remains a work in progress. I continue to look for answers to questions that I didn't have the heart to ask her when she was here, because I didn't want her to have to relive any of those experiences to give me the answers. My most recent discoveries are from the files that are now open to the public through the International Tracing Service, which has shared their files with the United States Holocaust Museum and Yad Vashem in Israel. And also a book that I recently found. The book's title is Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream, The Bargain That Broke Adolf Hitler and Saved My Mother by Stanley A. Goldman. And I have the book with me if you want to see it. Gave me a lot of information. And it is about the rescue of Jewish women from the Ravensbrück concentration camp. So I'm still finding new information, as well as information that validates the things that my mother did tell me. So my mother was from a little town called Szczerców, and you can see it here on the map. It had a Jewish population of around 3,000 at the time of the Nazi invasion, which meant that it was only 1/3 of the total population of the town. This is a picture of my mother, not a great picture, but we believe it was taken shortly before the war. And these are my grandparents. The This Ephraim Komornik was my grandfather, and Esther Komornik, my grandmother. I was named for her. He was a tailor and she was a seamstress, and together they owned and operated a women's clothing shop. My mother had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. The tallest boy in the back is Manala. That was my mother's oldest brother. He was 13 years older than her. And below him, my mother. Next to her is her sister Chaya. And then the little boy at the end is Avram Yosef. There was another sibling. Her name was Gittel, but we believe that she wasn't born yet at the time this picture was taken. And we only have these pictures because they were sent to relatives in America before the war. Now, my mother and her brother, Manala, were the only members of her family in Poland to survive the Holocaust. On September 1st, 1939, when my mother was 14 years old, her carefree teenage years came to an abrupt halt with the bombing of her town. It was a Friday night, and that's important for Jewish families because that's when our Sabbath begins. So her father would go to the synagogue for evening prayer. The house was all clean and everyone dressed and going to have their nicest meal of the week. Her mother would light the candles to welcome in the Sabbath. They would say a blessing over the wine and the bread, the challah, and then a blessing over their children. But they were not able to have their meal because the bombing started and they had to leave their home with only the clothes on their backs. So my grandparents decided to go to the town of Lodz. Lodz, I don't know if you can see it in this picture. Lodz was about 35 miles away, and it took a week to get there because they had to hide during the day and walk at night. During the war, acts of kindness were few and far between, but I don't think my mother ever forgot any of them. She told the story that one night they were walking and they saw a light in the distance. She said they followed it and came to a farm. The people there were so kind to them. They put down extra hay in their barn so they could rest, and they even shared a little food with them. But unfortunately, it wasn't long before they all had to leave because of the bombing. So finally, they did get to Lodz, and they had a place to stay there, but my grandparents decided after a week they needed to get back to their town and see what had become of their home and their business. So they headed back, and they got as far as Zelo. In Zelo, they were told not to bother going back because their town had been bombed so badly that there was nothing left but ashes. Things were difficult in Zelo. It was where they first started having to wear the yellow Star of David. They stayed there for about a month, living in a room that they shared with another family where they all slept on the floor. But during the day, they would stand in line for food. And sometimes, she said, they would come away with some bread, but many times they came away with nothing. So my grandparents decided they needed to move on. And they went from Zelo to Prushka. And Prushka was where my grandfather's family was from. In Prushka, they also had a small room. My grandmother was able to get some work as a seamstress, and my mother and a friend got a job working in the home of a German officer, cleaning his house for him. And he paid them with some food, which they shared with their families. But then the Germans rounded up all of the Jewish youth who could work, and she and her sister Chaya and her brother Avram Yaakov were sent to a work camp a few miles from town. She said that in the camp, their job was to clear yards and build roads. And my research tells me that they used the headstones from the local Jewish cemetery to pave those roads. My mother was what you would call feisty. She was a small lady, less than 5 feet tall, but she was very determined. And she used to sneak out of the camp at night whenever she could to go home to her parents and her sister. She knew they were hungry, and she tried to save some of her bread that she was given at the work camp. And then she also got whatever she could that friends could spare that she could take on her way and stop at the farmers and barter for a potato or two to take to her parents. And once, somehow, she heard that her mother was sick, and she begged the camp commander to please give her a pass to go home. He told her he couldn't give her a pass, and if she went, she was going on her own accord. So, being my mother, she went home. She got home and climbed into bed with her mother and was so happy and content to be with her. But then the Gestapo came by for an inspection. She wrote that she could see the pain in her mother's eyes as the officer came near. He asked her what she was doing there, and she told him that she came home because she was sick. She said he took her hand to see if she felt warm, and then he picked up a bucket of water and poured it over them and told my mother to come to his office. She was scared to death. She went to his office with her father and her uncle, who spoke German very well. You have to remember, my mother's language was Polish, not German, but she was so afraid that he was going to kill her when she got there. She was shaking so badly that she could barely speak. So the officer slapped her in the face and told her to quit being so nervous. And then he told her to go back to the camp and not to come home again. But you see, this officer knew something that my mother and her family didn't know. And that was that the work camp would eventually be dismantled and the workers all sent away. My mother did go back to the camp, but she continued to sneak out over the next year. Sometimes she would bring her sister Chaya with her, and sometimes she would bring a friend. On one occasion, her friend went with her, and when they came back, everyone was gone. She never saw her sister Chaya or her brother Avram Yosef again. I always had been curious about what happened to them. She never talked about them, and I believe she felt a lot of guilt that she didn't bring her sister home that particular night. And whenever I would ask her about them, she would say they just must have been sent to Auschwitz and killed there. Using their location and information that I found, it's my understanding that they were sent to a death camp by the name of Chelno. Chaya and her brother and the people, all the people in the work camp. So this is about Chelno. It was a place where the Germans first started using mobile killing units. People were brought there and told that it was a stop on the way to being relocated to another area where they could work and be safe. But they had to get cleaned up first. So everything was taken away from them, and then they were told that they needed to have a shower. At this point, they were beaten and shoved into the back of these trucks, and you can see in the picture. And the door was locked and sealed, and the fumes from the engine, the carbon monoxide, was redirected back into the area where everyone was. Ditches had already been dug about a 10-minute ride away from there. And by the time they got there, everyone inside was dead from poisoning and suffocation. And you can see here, it reads that 150,000 people were killed at Chelno. Only 7 were known to have escaped, and they worked in the burial detachment. It was pretty miraculous that these people escaped, because they were watched very much by the Germans. They did not want anyone to know what they were doing. And later, after they quit using Chelno, they even came back and dug up where the bodies were and burned everything, trying to cover up their evidence. Next, the Germans rounded up all of the Jews in Prussia and the towns in that region and sent them to a town by the name of Bielem. I found an article about it, and it reads, it began on August 22nd, 1942. Some 10,000 Jews in Bielem and the adjoining town were jammed inside one of the churches and held there in appalling conditions for some days. A selection was organized inside the church and the courtyard. during which a group of 922 people were separated from the rest as being physically fit for labor, and they were sent to the Lodz ghetto. My mother was in that church. She said that a friend told her that she heard that if you could tell the Germans you had an occupation, that would be a good thing. So she got in line and they didn't accept her. The friend urged her that she should really try this. So she got back in line and she told them she was a dressmaker, which she absolutely was not, but they accepted her. And so on that day, in August of 1942, when she was 17 years old, she had to say goodbye to her parents and her sister. She didn't know where she was being sent. She didn't know where her family was going to go. She never forgot her mother's last words to her, which were, "How will I live without you?" The article went on to say that the remaining Jews in Bielem were transported to the extermination camp at Chelmno. My mother never got over the loss of her family. After my father died, we brought her here to live in Birmingham, and she told me that every night she looked at her parents' pictures and cried for them. So my mother was sent to the Lodz ghetto, a terrible place of starvation and death. I have a short film clip that'll tell you about the ghetto.
Confidential, strictly secret, to the Regierungspräsident in Kalisz. Jews must be placed in a closed ghetto. I will fix the date when the establishment of the ghetto will suddenly take place. At the set hour, the previously defined border of the ghetto will be manned by forces assigned for this purpose. The streets will be closed off by barbed wire barriers and other blocking devices. We must succeed in drawing out all the valuables squirreled away by the Jews. It is obvious that the establishment of the ghetto is only a transitional measure. I reserve for myself the decision of when and by what means the city of Lodz will be cleansed of Jews. In any case, the final aim must be to burn out entirely this pestilent abscess. Übelhor.
March 16th, 1940. Bloody Thursday. A pogrom in Lodz. Jewish tenants in the big apartment building on Piotrkowska Street are ordered to leave their apartments in 15 minutes. Anyone found inside is simply shot. 100 people are killed. We run for our lives to the filthy and narrow streets of the renowned Baluti slum.
I am a simple Jew from Lodz. I am not a politician, but only a workhorse in heavy harness, pulling a wagon loaded with human lives. I must build from the ground up the self-administration of the ghetto as a small-scale city. There are between 8,000 and 20,000 skilled workers in the ghetto. I could organize them to work for the authorities. You would supply the raw materials. We would deliver the finished product against payment of wages or against the supply of food for the whole ghetto population. Chaim Rumkowski, eldest of the Jews of the Litzmannstadt ghetto.
Lodz was the second largest city in Poland, and it was mainly known for textile manufacturing. The Lodz ghetto was the only ghetto that became a German business. There were close to 100 factories in the ghetto. They manufactured many different items, from textiles and the uniforms for all the divisions of the German military, to leather goods, furniture, and ammunition. Even famous department stores and private businesses in Germany got in on the labor force in the ghetto and had their fine products produced there. Everyone over the age of 14 had to work, and in some cases, children over the age of 8. At its peak, it made over $100,000 a day for the Germans. And today that would be equivalent to over $4 million. In fact, because this ghetto was so profitable for the Germans, it was the last to be liquidated. So the deal was that the Germans got free labor and they were supposed to pay the Jews in food. But the amount of food was always minimal, and a lot of it was already spoiled by the time it arrived at the ghetto. I read that the Germans' first plan for Jewish annihilation was to slowly starve them to death. And that plan became a reality of life under Nazi control. The ghetto was established in February of 1940. By 1942, when my mother arrived there, rations had been cut to 600 calories a day. Hard labor, overcrowding, and starvation was what awaited my 17-year-old mother in the ghetto. She said when she arrived there, she saw what looked to her like walking corpses. People were so hungry and sickness was everywhere. Their food rations consisted of a little oil, sugar, and bread. And then they stood in line wherever they worked to get their one bowl of watered down soup, which was either made of vegetables or beans, but mostly water. And if you got a whole piece of a vegetable, you were doing good for that day. The children in the schools there waited for hours to get a bowl of soup or a piece of bread. And the ghetto was located in the most neglected part of Lodz. Most of the buildings had neither heat nor plumbing. There was a well where you could get water, but people also began putting containers on the roofs of the building to try and collect rainwater. There were rations for coal for heating, but the supply got smaller and smaller, and people began to dismantle their furniture and even the building itself to try and stay warm. People were weakened by hunger and exposure to the cold and became easy victims of disease. Due to their living conditions, more than 20% of the people there died of typhus fever, hypothermia, and starvation, and some killed themselves to escape their hopeless lives. In the factories, you could be shot if a spool of thread was missing, and there was mandatory attendance for public hangings of those thought to resist. At first, my mother lived in a room with 4 other girls. She worked in a factory where she sorted needles. After she had been there for a month, she found out that her brother Manolo was there. Now, as I said before, Manolo was 13 years older than my mother. He had a wife and a child. His wife, a little boy, and his little boy named Jacob had been taken away and murdered by the Germans. He was sharing a room with his sister-in-law, whose husband and child had also been murdered. Manolo told my mother to come live with him and he would take care of her. And that is where she stayed over the next 2 years until the ghetto was mostly emptied. During that time, the Germans were constantly deporting anyone who could not be of use to them. If you couldn't work for them, there was no reason for them to keep you alive. My mother said there were always rumors of who would be next on the list to be deported. And she said that some people would even pay another person with food to take their place when their name showed up on the list. They were lied to the entire time by the Germans. People were told that they were being sent to another area where they could work. And then in order to get people to leave, the Germans also even withheld more food so they'd be more willing to leave the ghetto on the deportations. And then they started to empty the ghetto. In September of 1942, an order was received for 24,000 people. This included children under the age of 10, along with anyone over 65 and anyone too sick to work. She wrote, "They took all the little children and the babies from their mother's arms. They threw them into trucks like they were little animals. Their crying and screaming was heartbreaking, but the mothers could do nothing." She told me that people did try and hide their children, but when they were found, many times they were killed on the spot. She also said that the Germans made this the job of the Jewish police. And I did read that some families even committed suicide because they did not want to be split up. My mother had a neighbor that lived across the hall from her in her building. She had 2 little girls. She had to give up her younger child. She said that the woman took a shoe off of her little girl's foot so she'd have something left of her. Out of the 6 million Jews who were murdered, 1.5 million were children. After this deportation, things slowed down a bit, but my mother and my uncle knew that their time would come eventually, and he told her that if her name was on the list before his, that he would volunteer to go with her. So here you can see a list of the deportations, and you can see that so many of them went to Chelmno until August. And that was the group that my mother and uncle were with. So, let's see. My mother and her brother Manolo were on one of the last transports out of Lodz. They were told that they were being relocated to a safe place where they could work. They had no idea where they were being sent. And they arrived at Auschwitz by way of cattle cars, which were packed so full of people that you could barely move. At Auschwitz, they were separated. She wrote, "Nobody can imagine our sorrow as we spoke those last words together. My brother said, 'I will never forget you. I took care of you until now, and I hope I won't lose you. May God be with you and take care of you, and may we live to see each other again.'" He told her he wasn't worried about himself. He was worried about her. The first thing that they saw when they arrived there were corpses hanging from the fences for miles. And then the selection process began. They separated the pregnant women, mothers with children, older people, anyone who was sick, putting them into the section that would be the first group to be taken to the gas chambers. My mother wrote, "The Germans took my group to what looked like a big house. They took away our clothes, giving us rags to wear, and they cut all our hair off. It looked like a terrible madhouse." She said in Auschwitz, there were all nationalities and you could hear many different languages being spoken, but everywhere you could see starvation and they were always hungry. Their day started, I skipped myself. In her barracks, they were so full that the women actually slept on top of each other. Their day started at 4 in the morning when they dragged in large containers of coffee. That was their breakfast. And it actually was not coffee, it was chicory and grain, which was cheaper and more bitter tasting. Their other meal of the day was some kind of watered down soup again. And she said that She had to share her bowl with 2 other girls. Every day they were lined up for inspection. Anyone who did not show up was beaten with a whip. If you were sick or something was wrong with you, you were pulled out of line and sent to your death. My mother said that she actually was pulled out of line one time, and something happened where the officer was distracted or called away, but the person behind her pulled her back in, and whoever that was, they saved her life. My mother was in Auschwitz only a few weeks before she, as a part of a group of young Polish Jewish women, were taken to a building which we believe was maybe a waiting area for the gas chamber. According to Stanley Goldman's book about these women, the gas chambers were so busy that they were waiting to be brought there. My mom said that they didn't know where they were or what was going to happen to them. She said they stayed there in this building a day and a night without hearing any sign of life. And she wrote, "It gave us the feeling that death was near, but we tried to keep each other from thinking of the horrible things that were happening around us." And then an order was received for 500 young women to work in the Krupp munitions factory in Neukölln in Berlin. And once more, her life was spared. It turned out that her life was spared due to a clerical error. They actually took the wrong group of women. My mother said that as they marched them through the streets in Berlin to the factory, people asked where these women with the rags and their heads shaven had come from, and they were told they had come from Siberia. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Krupps and their factory. You could do a whole nother story on the Krupps, but I feel like it's important for you to know about them. So the Krupp factory actually started off as a steel factory back in the 1500s. Through the generations, they became interested in producing ammunition and armaments. And they found out through World War I that that could be very profitable. However, when the Germans lost in World War I, they had to sign a treaty that prohibited them from making weapons. So the Krupps got around this by saying that they were producing farm equipment. They continued to produce weapons and received their first order from Hitler's government in 1933 for 135 Panzer I tanks. In the 1930s, Gustav Krupp's unfaltering nationalism for the fatherland turned him onto the path of becoming a stern Nazi supporter. In fact, he insisted on taking the same loyalty oath to Hitler that his military had to take. The Krupps became the largest armament suppliers to the German government, and by the end of the war, they had tripled their worth. It was Alfred Krupp who in 1942 suggested to Berlin the idea of extermination through work as a way to exploit the manpower in the concentration camps. Hitler obliged him by allowing Krupp's representatives to enter the camps and pick out laborers. The Krupp factories became the largest employer of slave laborers of any enterprise in Germany. My research found that the slave laborers in the Krupp factories had a horrible existence. Aside from starvation, rampant disease, lack of medical care or sanitation, they were also faced with constant beatings by their SS guards. And most died under those harsh conditions that they were forced to endure. They literally worked them to death. At the Nuremberg trials, a prosecutor by the name of Drexel Spritzer said that Alfred Krupp's exploitation of slave labor was worse than any other industrialist. Nowhere else was there such sadism, such senseless barbarity, such shocking treatment of people as dehumanized material. Krupp was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and he was supposed to give up all the holdings in his industries. However, this did not happen. And when I'm speaking to school kids, I tell them that maybe their teacher will give them extra credit if they find out why this didn't happen. And hint is that it was due to an American by the name of John McCloy, representing the American Office of Strategic Services. And there's a book about the Krupps. It's called The Arms of Krupp by William Manchester. It gives you lots of information on the Krupps, and I recommend it. And next time you're in an elevator, if you look up, you probably will see something on there that says Krupp. Okay, so back to my mother. By the time my mother came to work at the factory in Nuclean, they were desperate for laborers. Her group was given to the charge of 2 SS officers who were very different from any SS I've ever read about. They were a man and a woman. They called the man the Kommandoführer and the woman Mutti, which is German for mother, but they were told never to let anyone hear them call her that. Recently, I found the name of the Kommandoführer. It was Bruno Kretschik, and the woman was Marguerite Trapenau. She was 39 years old and the head supervisor of females at the factory. Between the 2 of them, they protected my mother's group from being beaten by the other SS guards. It seems that these 2 people actually felt something for these young women, and they tried to help whenever possible. Now, that being said, working in the factory was not a walk in the park, but it was certainly better than Auschwitz. While my mother worked in the Krupp factory, she never saw the light of day. There were 2 12-hour shifts, and she worked the daytime shift. So they marched them from their barracks to the factory at 4 in the morning when it was dark, and then brought them back in the evening when it was dark. And they were constantly counted to make sure that no one had escaped. As for food, they were given a piece of bread, 4.4 ounces, which was to last them for the week, and then they had their bowl of watered down soup during the day. I read that in rare cases, local people were said to have thrown food over the camp's fence to where the barracks were because they could see how malnourished these girls were. My mother worked next to a German woman who told her that she was a communist and she hated the Nazis. And she said that she would bring, whenever she could, a small sandwich for her, and she would hide it. And my mother had to promise that she wouldn't tell anyone else that she had done this for her. Another act of kindness. She thought she was working on small clocks or watches, but they were actually working on components for airplanes, machine guns, and ignition devices. And that's why they needed young women, because they needed those small hands to work on those little parts. During her work there, she cut her finger on a piece of metal, and it became badly infected. So I don't know how she did this, but she saved up her bread and paid someone with it who amputated the top part of her right index finger. I can't imagine how painful that must have been, but she said she hid it because she was so afraid of being sent away. So she also told me that every Saturday night, the Americans would bomb that area. And at first they were all so excited because they thought the Americans were coming and they were going to save them. But then it became very scary because when there was bombing, the only place they could go to hide were ditches that they themselves had dug. And then at one point, her barracks caught on fire and they couldn't get out until the Germans let them out. And she was afraid that she was going to burn up with the barracks. And she said she cried because she thought she was going to die there and her parents would never know where she was. After she had been at the factory for 9 months, the Kommandoführer received an order that he must send half of this group to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The war was coming to an end, and Mutti and the Kommandoführer knew that they were sending these women to their death. She said they gathered the whole group together and that he and Mutti talked and talked and cried, And finally, they told them that they could not decide who they were going to send. So when the day came to leave, all of them left together. The Kommandoführer and Mutti went with them. And she said that when they got to Ravensbrück, that he asked the guards there to please not cut the girls' hair off again, that they had kept themselves clean and there was no reason to cut their hair. Ravensbrück was a women's concentration camp with lots of subcamps. They were used for slave labor. But at Ravensbrück, medical experimentation was done on the women there. There was a gas chamber and 3 crematoriums. My mother only stayed there for a few days before she and her group were rescued by the Swedish Red Cross. Her memory from Ravensbrück was a guard with an apple in his hand who would throw it in the air and catch it, throw it, catch it. And she felt that he was doing this so that they could see that he had food and they didn't. It was the end of the war. So the Swedish Red Cross, in a secret meeting with Heinrich Himmler, who was second in command only to Hitler and the man responsible for the extermination of Europe's Jews, he met with this group from the Swedish Red Cross. Not even Hitler knew about it. The goal of the meeting was to allow the International Red Cross to rescue citizens from the Scandinavian countries and bring them back to Sweden. Himmler agreed to this. And then the Swedish section of the World Jewish Congress heard about it. And they sent their own representative to meet with Himmler. A German Jewish man who was living in Sweden came and met secretly with Himmler, and Himmler agreed to let them have these Jewish prisoners. And then the International Red Cross agreed that they would take them with the others. Between April 22nd and 28th of 1945, about 7,500 women were liberated. Out of that number, 1,000 were Jewish, and my mother's group made up half of that 1,000. So these buses are the white buses, which you can see. They were just regular kind of school buses, but this is what the Red Cross used to liberate these women. The Russians told the Swedes that they would not guarantee safe passage for these buses. They were coming in and they were not going to stop. But the Swedes decided they were going to go ahead and chance it anyway. So my mother said that many times when they were driving away, the bombing was so bad that buses had to pull over. Everyone ran out and hid till the bombing was done. They got back in the bus and rode on some more until there was more bombing. 3 women were killed and 3 were injured, but they made it through and they were ferried from Copenhagen to Sweden, where they received medical attention, food, and clothing. My mother said, here we go, Sweden. My mother told me that the Swedish people were wonderful to them. She said they gave them clothes and food, and then the women grabbed as much as they could and even tried to steal as much as they could. She said the Swedes kept telling them, it's okay, there will be more food tomorrow. You don't have to steal it. But they were so afraid, and it was hard for them to trust anyone. They thought maybe they would take the food away from them. And growing up, my mother always made sure that we had potatoes in our house because she knew that if we had potatoes, we wouldn't starve. In later years, I used to look through her refrigerator and throw out all her outdated foods because she just could not bring herself to throw food away. So during her stay in Sweden, the war ended, and my mother remembered that her mother had 2 brothers. One came to America and the other came to England. Miraculously, she was able to get in touch with the brother in England. He could not bring her, but he wrote to his brother in America, in New York, and he was able to bring her to America. So that's how she got here. This is a picture of my mother after the war. A picture from her wedding to my father in Columbus, Georgia. That's where my father's family was, and they provided this lovely wedding for them along with her very nice blue suit. Another picture. Putting my mother's story together has been like riding an emotional roller coaster. At one end, it's quite painful to see the depths that mankind can sink to. And then it's so amazing to see written in history the truths that my mother had told me. And finally, it is uplifting to find out that there were people who did not lose all of their humanity during the darkest of times. I would like to end by reading, I know it's been a long night, but I do have something else that was in that drawer that my mother wrote, and it's called Auschwitz Memories. People, do you know of graveyards without a trace left to show that human beings were buried there? The fires are burning in the German camps. The prisoners never smile. There are thousands of bleak barracks. Around the barracks, there are barbed wires. The barbed wire fences are lined with electric wires. When the sun comes out, somehow it is only for the German captors, but for the prisoners, it seems always dark. Pains and complaints of the tortured never stop. We miss the days when we had freedom. We are bewildered. They bring more people to this man-made hell. What is to become of these people? To the Nazis who showed no mercy, these people were less than animals. We could feel that death was near us. It was cracking its whip to scare the people. Every minute we expected to be shoved into the gas chamber. Can you people understand what it means to be picked out? All you free people in the world, can you understand what it is to be called to stand in line and to think it will be you who will be picked out for the gas chamber? With a clean heart and innocent soul, we struggled with the fear of death. The lawless convicted us, the innocent ones. The prisoners prayed with what little hope they had left in God as the last light in our hearts blew out and the last little hope diminished while the ruthless Germans stood there laughing. Broken hearts, crying mothers. From the arms of their mothers, the children were taken away by brutal murderers, the soul dying in them for their children. All free mothers and fathers in the world, free people, do you understand this? Where are the convicteds' graveyards? With what kind of death did they disappear? Who was praying for their souls? Where are the children that were taken from their mothers? You haven't got a graveyard convicted, but we keep your memory deep within our hearts and minds for always, and you will never be forgotten as long as we shall live. The Jewish people will never forget, but the rest of the world, would they remember? I want you to know that my parents never taught us to hate anyone, but to treat everyone with the respect and dignity that we all deserve. And thank you so much for inviting me. I have one more picture. This is for my daughter Lauren's wedding. Sorry, you'll have to forgive me. This is really hard for me to do. You can see the wedding is 2007 and my whole family is there, my brothers and their families that we had at that time. And as of this May, we now have, my parents would have had 15 great grandchildren. So we're pretty excited about that.
So thank you so much. Everybody give her a hand. I'm sorry you can't hear it, but I know you touched everybody's heart with that presentation. So everybody just take a minute and have a deep breath and reflect for a second before we go into questions. I know she covered a lot of area and emotions, you know, from her amazing research, which I continue to learn from you, so thank you. You know, to what it was like to be in the ghettos and then the camps and just the randomness of everything, from the random acts of kindness to the random acts of selections. It really was just a miracle that she made it. Everybody is thanking you. Esther, you can open the chat and see the chat too.
Yeah.
You know, for me, the whole story of Ravensbrück and the white buses was really an interesting thing to learn. I know when we discovered all of that, you know, the fact that there were these deals being negotiated at the end with the hopes that some of the Nazi hierarchy would get some better treatment. And that's really was the only reason behind it. You know, they're trying to save their skins. And, you know, fortunately for your mother, she was part of that. But there were several incidences of this, not necessarily with the Swedish Red Cross, but where certain Nazi officials tried to negotiate their way into favor towards the end of the war.
I thought that story was just so amazing. And that was from this book, he really got into the man who did the negotiations for the Jews. And it was really amazing that just the fact that they brought him into Germany, a German Jew brought him into Germany and to meet with Himmler, whose job it was to annihilate him. It just was really amazing. And there's not enough out there in history about it. I think it's something that they haven't made a big deal of, and it's quite a story.
Okay, well, Robin wanted to know what happened to your mother's brother that survived.
He, after the war, he was in a displaced persons camp. He met his next wife and started a family, and my parents found him and brought him to America. And his son is on here watching.
Okay, great. Sorry, I couldn't get myself unmuted for a second there. Great, thank you.
Hey, Esther. Joyce Shevin, excuse me, asked how your parents met.
Okay, my father actually was from the same town as my mother. He was about 15 years older than her. And after the war, I think she may have seen his name somewhere. And I mentioned in my story that they stayed in this little town of Zlo, and they had another family that lived in this room with them. Well, that was my father's parents and his sister. And my father was trying to find what happened to his family after the war. So they got in touch with each other, and him thinking that she would be able to tell him what happened to them, where they went from there, which she wasn't. But the family she was staying with in New York and the family he was staying with in Columbus, Georgia, I could think kind of felt like this would be a good way for both of them to find somebody else that would, you know, make their lives more.
Yes. Hi, Esther. Thank you so much. I think the information about Himmler agreeing to let all the Jews go, I've heard that before somewhere, but I don't really understand it. Do you have any rationale as to why he would do that?
Yeah, I think that he agreed to doing this. It wasn't so many Jews, but they think that he felt like he might get a better deal after the war if he showed that he was a compassionate person and was allowing this to happen.
Sure thing. Hi, guys. Hi, Esther. Thank you so much for sharing. I wondered if you would share with us your mother's yard site, and so that we can say her Kaddish.
You know, that changes every year. So she died in November, I believe, of 2006. So, but I would be glad to post it somewhere when it comes up. That's very sweet of you. Thank you.
Esther, it's Esther Levy. The story I always heard about how your parents met, I don't know if it's true, is that Max, your father, who was in Columbus, went to New York after the war to try to find who survived in the family. And I think, this is what I remember, that your mom might have been working for one of the agencies, maybe HIAS or one of the agencies, and he went there and she was helping him, and they realized that they had you know, connections, and they knew each other.
Wow.
And I just have to say that I was at their wedding when they got married, and they got married in my Aunt Sadie's living room. And I was maybe 8 years. I don't know what year. What do you know? What year they got married?
Oh God, I have to look it up.
Okay. It was 48 or something around there. I don't know. But anyway, I was at their wedding.
I know. I know. I still have her blue suit that she wore at her wedding that somebody from your family bought for her. It was a big thing. I never heard that story before, so that's interesting to hear. I think I was under the impression that she had written him first or something, but I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know either. That's just, you know, the story I got in the pipeline, whatever.
Thanks.
Can I say hello to Esther?
Hi, that's my cousin.
How are you?
Good. I'm good.
I am Manala's son. I live in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. And Esther, I have to commend you. It takes a lot of intestinal fortitude to do what you've done. And I'm so proud of you, and it's so good to see you. I haven't seen you in a number of years. But you know what? I have memories when we came to America, and your mother and father were responsible for that. I remember when my father first got his first job in Atlanta, it was because of your father. And I know that your father was responsible for helping many people come to America after the war. And I just have so many memories of both your mother and father and the good things that they did. And I just, I'm so pleased to see you and so proud of what you have done this evening. And it's so good that people care about what you have to say, as is evidenced by all the people on this Zoom. And, you know, I've done a little bit of research, not as much as you have. I know that my father and your mother were together in the Lodge Ghetto. It was very interesting when you were talking about the Lodge Ghetto, Piotrkowska Street, which was a major street there. I don't know if you know, Lodge was a textile town before the war, during the war. And it was my mother's father that had a wholesale business on number 56 Piotrkowska Street. And it's amazing all the pieces that we put together. I hear things, I read things, and you've told things this evening that I didn't know about my family. It's very interesting. So I appreciate what you've shared with everybody, and it's good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, of course, I'm telling my mother's story, but Abe's father has an amazing story. He didn't like to talk about his experiences, and he wouldn't talk about his experience. No. But at one time there was an article from the Atlanta Journal written about him, and I believe they talked about how he survived and how he was, wasn't he under?
Well, you were correct. My father was on the transport from the Lodge Ghetto to Auschwitz.
Right.
And he survived the death march in Auschwitz. And years ago, when Adolf Eichmann was on trial in Israel, it just so happened that a journalist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution came into my father's tailor shop, and he noticed my father's tattoo on his left forearm, and he knew what it was. And a conversation ensued from there. And the next thing we knew, there were reporters at our home, and we were on the news. And it had spoken about how my father had survived Auschwitz. And, you know, it was interesting. Our parents never spoke about the atrocities that occurred during the war. It was true in my family. It was true in your family. I was 25 years old before I knew that my father was married before and lost, I think it was 2 children in the camps. I didn't know. And it was such a shock to me. I was afraid to ask my mother if she knew. I didn't want to hurt her. He told me, and I thought it wasn't my story to tell. I never shared it with anyone. I assumed she knew. If she didn't know, I didn't want to bring it up. I was just so sensitive to our parents and the pain that they had endured. And I'm sure you're the same. Mm-hmm. And most children of survivors were that way, are that way. So anyway, growing up a child of Holocaust survivors has been an interesting journey. A very interesting journey.
And thank you for mentioning my father. He, after the war, he looked all over the world for survivors from his family. He had lots of siblings, lots of nieces and nephews, and not one of them made it. So whenever he found anybody, a cousin, whoever, he made it his job to make sure that they came to America. And Esther's family, Esther Gerson Levine's family, were very instrumental in doing that. I mean, they got the papers, they just did so much. But my father looked for whoever he could find to bring them here.
And he did tzedakah whenever he could. I remember that.
Yes.
I remember. Anyway, good to see you.
Thank you, Abe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this family story with us. There is another question from Leanne. Leanne, do you want to unmute yourself? Hi.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Esther. It's difficult to explain how we're related, but we are. It goes very far back. My question is, when did your mother start writing the letters and how did you find them?
It was actually, she was going to write a book. And I think she started it when I was really young. I think a neighbor came over and would type the pages for her. And I just remember them being in my home for forever. I think in high school is when I really noticed them. But she never finished it. I think she probably started it off when I was just probably elementary school age or even younger maybe. But she never continued with it, but they were there. So that was, it was great to have those papers when I was ready to tell her story. And I really felt like I had to tell her story because I would get very upset with her that she wouldn't tell her story. But, now I can understand how she couldn't possibly have told her story. I mean, she didn't think her English was that great, and to get up in front of a crowd of people and talk about all those things that had happened, I just think it would have been too much for her. I think toward her later years, she got a little more interested in talking about what happened, and that was when I was able to get a tape recording done with her. And I really, at the time I did the tape recording, she spoke so softly that I didn't think it picked it up. And so I kind of put it aside. At the time, I think I told her, well, I'll come back and we'll do this. And I think she was looking forward to my coming back and finishing it. But, I had kids that were growing up and I just didn't get back to it. And plus I thought, this isn't going to work really well. And it wasn't until much later that I picked up those tapes. And I think my brother, Herb, had them made into CDs. And once I put them in my computer, you could hear them perfectly. So I wish I had gone back and finished up. But, one of the crazy things was this thing about her being in the Krupp factory. I remember her talking about it, and my father was really upset because he said, the way you talk about it makes it sound like you were in some country club or something. Well, to her, compared to us, it was a country club. I mean, where she came from, it was so much better. And this couple were just amazing. They would do anything for them. And they really cared about them. And even the guy who wrote this book, Steve Stanley Goldman, he was even surprised at this couple, this SS couple, and what they did. And he really kept trying to find reasons why they were nice to these women, because it was just impossible. And he felt that at first he thought, well, maybe it was because it was the end of the war and they did need these laborers so bad. But I think the conclusion was that somehow these women affected them. And that's a long answer to the question you asked me probably ended up not having anything to do with it, but I think I did answer your question, didn't I, Leanne?
Yeah, you did. Thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear it all.
And Leanne is a newfound relative on my father's side of the family who's coming to us from England.
Really far away.
Yes, and my friend Sandy Walton is doing our family tree, and she found her. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It's been a so long journey. Just I find out so much information about my new family, and it's so inspirational to hear. Your mother was extremely brave, Esther.
Thank you.
Esther, I have a question. The couple, were they ever recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations?
I'm not sure that they were, but I do know that they were not tried for war crimes because a lot of the people, I think they were arrested, but not tried because people stood up for them and said what they had done for them.
Okay.
I want to thank you, Esther, for your story. It was a very moving story. I was just curious if, when you were growing up, if your parents spoke Polish at home.
No. Eli is also a child of survivors. My parents would not speak Polish. They never wanted to hear Polish again. They had terrible experiences with the Polish people. They spoke Yiddish, but they wouldn't, they didn't want us to speak Yiddish because someone had said to them that if your kids speak Yiddish, they'll talk with an accent. So we could understand what our parents were saying, but we would answer back in English. But yeah, no Polish. Until much, much later after I brought my mother here and she found a little boyfriend, and he was a Jewish survivor, but he was also from Poland, and they would speak Polish to each other. And I was shocked because I didn't think she would ever speak that language again.
So you didn't pick up any Polish at home growing up?
No Polish. Sometimes she would sing little songs in Polish, but that was about it.
On my behalf, I want to thank everyone, and I want to thank Esther and all of her family members for sharing your stories and filling in answers that we didn't know before. And I know Esther was glad to hear all of that too. So thank you everyone for being with us. Melissa?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to give another word of deep gratitude to Esther for sharing, and for your cousins, new and long time. I also, I suppose it goes without saying that we're still challenged by our current situation in this pandemic of COVID-19. We are a nonprofit. The Birmingham Holocaust Education Center depends heavily on people's generosity. Many of you are regular supporters. So if you're so compelled, just a reminder that this is how we're able to provide all of our programming for free, and we'll continue to do so regardless. And thank you for making a big difference in all of our lives by being here together to witness Esther's mother's story, Tobi's story. Have a wonderful evening, and stay tuned for some special programming in the summer. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and be well.